Imagine morning. A foggy start in 1929. Instead of standing in a sterile terminal with air conditioning and shops for duty-free shopping, you find yourself at the edge of a grassy field that, for some reason, is proudly called an international airport. Your shoes are likely muddy from the ground, since asphalt runways were rare then, like polite bus drivers today. But none of that worries you. What concerns you is something else. That fragile plywood and aluminum plane, coughing black smoke 100 meters off, is the aircraft you just paid as much for as a decent car. Welcome to the golden age of aviation, an era when flying was not merely a way to get from point A to point B to attend a meeting, but a true, full-scale adventure with an unpredictable ending. Today, we complain about tight seats or dry chicken, but early travelers saw the world differently. For them, the fact that they had risen into the sky and, more importantly, returned safely to the ground was a miracle, bordering on divine intervention. Before boarding and trying to sleep in a seat that shakes your teeth loose, let's talk about prep. In the 1920s, you couldn't simply toss a backpack over your shoulder and go. Oh no. Preparing for a journey resembled equipping for a polar expedition. The first item for seasoned flyers then was clothing. If you look at old black and white photographs, you'll notice a strange detail. Even in July heat, passengers dressed as if heading to the North Pole. Ladies in heavy fur coats, gentlemen in thick woolen overcoats, scarves, and gloves. This was not just fashion, though it certainly looked elegant. It was a harsh necessity. "Excuse me, Mr. Stewart," a newcomer might ask. "Why is it so cold inside?" "It's not cold, sir," a flight attendant would reply, if there was one on board, which was rare in the 1920s. "It's only -15 outside. The heater is just a hole in the floor pulling warm air from the engine. Provided the wind blows in the right direction. Ceiling cabins wasn't a thing yet. The fuselage's thin lining kept you from being blown away, but as you gained altitude, inside and outside temperatures quickly matched. So, if you planned to get even a little sleep during the flight, your fur coat was your main blanket, mattress, and life buoy. Sleeping in a light jacket could mean waking up with double pneumonia, if you were lucky. Besides clothing, your small bag contained items that a modern passenger would consider artifacts of an alien civilization. For example, cotton wool. A lot of cotton wool. Travelers knew airlines might forget sandwiches, but never cotton wool. Why? To prevent deafness. Engine noise was so loud you'd risk deafening yourself without makeshift earplugs. The instructions were simple. Roll up a ball of cotton, stuff it deep into your ear, and pray that the vibration wouldn't shake it back out. Standing there in 1929's foggy field, you realize this trip is as much about trusting the unknown as moving from A to B. It's a leap of faith, an adventure into the clouds. Welcome to Lectures Under the Moon with Daniel Hayes, where we explore fascinating stories from history and technology. Another critically important accessory was the ink pen, but not just any pen, an empty one. Or rather, you had to be incredibly cautious with it. The problem was that, due to the altitude changes, ink from fountain pens had a troublesome tendency to shoot out unexpectedly, splattering blue stains onto jackets, dresses, and important documents that wouldn't wash out. Surely a business person would lament, looking at a spreading blot on their pocket. But I wanted to write a postcard to my mother right from the clouds. My companion would justify herself, saying, "I just wanted to send her a message while flying high above the land." It was a common dilemma. Special aviation pens with sealed reservoirs would appear later. For now, passengers learned from their mistakes, ruining wardrobe items worth a small fortune. But the most valuable luggage people carried on board wasn't their baggage, but their psychological state of mind. Let's be honest, The safety statistics of the 1920s were, shall we say, inspiring for philosophical reflection. Every flight was less of a journey and more of a gamble, heads or tails, guided by the laws of aerodynamics. This atmosphere left its mark on the waiting lounge. People weren't just sitting glued to their phones, they were writing letters, writing farewell notes. In some airports, there was a fully official service, an in-house notary, available right before departure. For a modest fee, you could draft or update your will while mechanics were topping off oil in your aircraft's engine. It wasn't considered bad form or a sign of panic. Instead, it was seen as pragmatism and care for loved ones. Dear Martha, if this marvelous machine should happen to become part of the landscape somewhere in Kansas, I bequeath you the house and my shares. Sitting down in a woven chair, yes, woven from rattan, like on a country porch, the passenger experienced a singular mixture of fear and excitement. This was a time when pilots were like rock stars, demigods in leather jackets and aviator sunglasses. Passengers gazed at them with reverence. If a pilot stepped out to speak to the crowd and said that the delay was due to tightening a nut, no one was annoyed or demanded compensation. Everyone understood that this was the only person who knew how to keep this flying tower in the air. Speaking of tickets, those cost a fortune. A cross-continental flight could cost as much as a typical worker's earnings for half a year. This naturally shaped the audience. On board were either the very wealthy or those traveling out of urgent necessity. Business people, movie stars, diplomats, and adventurers from all walks of life. This created an atmosphere of an exclusive, closed elite club. Everyone examined and evaluated each other, exchanged polite conversation, trying to outshout the roar of the propellers. "Are you flying to Chicago on business?" asked a gentleman in a tweed suit. "No, I'm going to my daughter's wedding. I hope to arrive before she changes her mind," I shouted back, clutching my briefcase. And finally the boarding was complete. The door slammed shut, severing you from solid, reliable ground. If you were lucky enough to be on a late 1920s flight, the steward would walk through the cabin, checking that the windows were securely closed so they wouldn't be torn out by a gust of wind. The engines coughed, sputtered, and spat out clouds of grayish smoke before finally settling into a steady, deafening hum. The plane began to accelerate. The jolt was so intense that it felt like riding a cart over cobblestones at 100 kilometers per hour, only with the speed of the woven chair's creak as the passengers turn pale and clutch their armrests tightly. The ground slips away beneath you, and suddenly you're in the air. Your task now is to spend several hours, maybe an entire day, inside this vibrating metal box. Not just to pass the time, but to try and rest. After all, you've paid a hefty sum for this ticket, and the brochure promised unparalleled comfort and speed. Speed might be possible, but comfort is a different matter. Because as soon as the sun begins to dip toward the horizon, the problem faced by pilots of the 1920s reemerges, a problem that engineers of that era had yet to resolve elegantly. Aircraft of that time were daytime birds. Like their passengers, they feared the darkness. Navigation instruments were primitive, there was no runway lighting, and flying at night was not just risky, it was practically impossible. But what could you do if you needed to cross an entire continent and the daylight hours lasted only 12? Would you really land in a field and spend the night under the wing? No. Airlines devised a solution that now seems the height of logistical madness, but back then was the only option available. Buckle up. Well, hold on. There are no seatbelts yet either. Just hold on tight. We're about to enter the strangest part of our journey, a hybrid scheme designed to let you sleep without stopping the forward motion toward your destination. Officially, this project was called Transcontinental Air Transport, or TAT. It sounds impressive, but those who have a nose for trouble quickly turned this acronym into something more understandable. People started interpreting TAT as take a train, which in our language simply meant don't show off, Just hop on the train. And honestly, that advice was much more honest than all the glamorous posters of the era. Let's understand why this strange need to jump from sky to rails and back arose in the first place. It all comes down to darkness. Night was not just a time of day for pilots of that era. It was an insurmountable wall. There were no radars, GPS navigators, or advanced instrument landing systems, not even in the planning stages. Pilots flew visually. That is, they simply looked out of the window. Landmarks included railroads, rivers, large billboards with tobacco ads on rooftops, and church steeples. As soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the world below turned into inky blackness. Flying in such conditions was like playing Russian roulette, where instead of one bullet in a chamber, there were 5. The chance of finding an unlit dirt strip in total darkness was virtually non-existent, and the likelihood of colliding with a treetop was absolute. That's why airlines, led by the legendary Charles Lindbergh, yes, the same man who crossed the Atlantic and became the face of this daring venture, came up with a brilliantly absurd plan. If an airplane couldn't fly at night, then passengers would travel by night on something that wasn't afraid of darkness. The train. This was how your ideal route across the United States looked, taking 48 hours. Astoundingly fast by the standards of that time, when an ordinary train took nearly 4 days. Day 1. You depart from New York aboard the Ford Model 3M. The very tin can we will discuss in more detail later. All day long you endure noise, vibrations, and jostling. You fly westward, covering hundreds of miles. But as dusk begins to deepen over the state of Ohio, the pilot starts searching for land. The plane lands in the city of Columbus. You, deafened, exhausted, and probably a little seasick, crawl out of the cabin. But you're not allowed to go straight to the hotel. No. You're immediately transferred into a car and driven to the railway station. There, shrouded in steam and the smell of coal smoke, awaits you the night express train of Pennsylvania. And this is where the sharpest contrast in the history of travel occurs. From the roaring, cramped aluminum tube, you are transported into the realm of Victorian comfort. Heavy velvet curtains, carpets that absorb the sound of footsteps, polished mahogany, and most importantly, silence. Of course, the relative clicking of wheels is present, but after the scream of aircraft engines, it seems gentle, almost lullaby-like. __quote_1__ softly, says the conductor in a pristine white uniform, placing a plate of hot soup before you. And that soup remains in the bowl. It doesn't splash onto your lap every time you hit an air pocket. You can eat with metal utensils, drink from a glass, and converse with your fellow traveler without raising your voice. It's a moment of bliss. You feel like a person who has returned from war to a warm home. The night on the train was the only time during the entire 48 hours of travel when you could sleep normally. You changed into pajamas in the spacious, neat bathroom with hot water, laid down on a wide berth with starched linen, and sank into sleep to the steady rhythm of the train. It seemed that the worst was behind you, that progress had finally turned to your favor, showing a humane face. Oh, how mistaken you were. The morning of the second day arrived mercilessly. The train was arriving in the town of Windoka, Oklahoma, or another transfer point depending on the route. It was still dark, or just the faint glow of dawn. Wake-up time. You had to leave this cozy, warm carriage and head back to the airfield. That moment of returning to the airplane was psychologically the hardest. You had just gotten used to comfort. Your body relaxed, and suddenly you're shoved back into a Ford Model 3. The engines roar to life, and the vibration returns with doubled force, shaking you to the core. Your head, still heavy from sleep, begins to throb in harmony with the propellers. Quote 2, shouts the second pilot, trying to outshout the engines. Our course lies toward New Mexico. The weather promises to be invigorating. In the language of 20s aviators, invigorating weather meant that you would be tossed from side to side across the country, so much so that your breakfast in the lavatory would want to come back up. The entire second day is spent flying over deserts and mountains. The heat gives way to cold, you keep biting into earplugs, and you watch the endless landscapes below, trying to convince yourself that the 2-day savings in travel time are worth these hardships. In the evening of the second day, the story repeats itself. Landing in Clovis, New Mexico. Again the station, again the life-saving train. This time, the Santa Fe Railway. Again dinner on a white tablecloth, again a soft bed. You fall asleep thinking that humans are creatures capable of adapting to anything, even such a stark contrast as the mixture of comfort and stress. On the morning of the third day, the final push begins. You switch back into the airplane once more, heading toward Los Angeles. And when the landing gear finally touches the runway in California, you step out of the plane not just as a passenger, but as a hero. You have crossed the continent in just 2 days. Your friends, who took the usual train, are still somewhere around Kansas, bored and playing cards, gazing at the endless fields. And you are already here. Yes, you've gone deaf. You're swayed by the turbulence, and perhaps you've sworn never to take to the skies again. Yet you did. This scheme existed for barely a year and a half. It was insanely expensive, logistically complex, and honestly, exhausting. The ticket price was around $350, a huge sum at the time, enough to buy a brand new Ford. Only the elite could afford such a luxurious indulgence. Bankers, Hollywood stars, and those for whom time itself was worth more than gold. But it was this strange hybrid of train and airplane that revealed the fundamental flaw of aviation. It could never become a fully reliable means of transport as long as it depended on the sun. Passengers didn't want to interrupt their journeys. They wanted to step into a seat in New York and get out in Los Angeles, preferably sleeping along the way, without switching vehicles like switchmen. Engineers understood this. They needed to make passengers not just endure the flight, but live within it. To do that, they had to change the very space inside the aircraft. The ghastly woven chairs, which pressed painfully into the lower back, had to go, replaced by an illusion of home, a sense of safety. And this is where the story becomes truly fascinating. How aircraft designers tried to transform a vibrating aluminum tube into an English lord's sitting room. Because if you cannot eliminate noise and danger, at least you can drape them in velvet and mahogany. Forget the train. The train stayed on the ground. Now we would have to sleep in the sky. And believe me, the first attempts to create comfort at 3,000 meters altitude looked both touching and absurd at once. Welcome aboard, where interior design battled the laws of physics, and mostly lost. So, you climb a small aluminum ladder and step inside the aircraft. If this is your first flight in the late 1920s, say, on the legendary four-door, your initial reaction is likely not admiration, but mild bewilderment. You expected to see futuristic technology, shimmering chrome, instrument panels, blinking lights. Yet instead, you find yourself on your grandmother's porch. Right in front of you, lined up along the sides, are woven rattan chairs. Yes, those same from summer gazebos, squeaking when a plump cat jumps on them. This isn't a design statement or an attempt to create a picnic atmosphere. It's a strict dictatorship of scales. Back then, the chief enemy of aircraft designers was not aerodynamics. It was often dismissed with a wave of the hand, leading to boxy planes, or gravity itself. Every extra kilogram on board meant less fuel in the tanks, or fewer paying passengers in the cabin. The soft, spring-filled chair with padding and a wooden frame weighed prohibitively much. The woven chair, by contrast, weighed almost nothing. The choice was clear. "Excuse me," a passenger in a costly coat asks the mechanic, "but won't this structure fall apart if we hit turbulence?" "Sir, this is the finest rattan from the colonies," the mechanic responds cheerfully. "He's flexible, he breathes, and, most pleasantly, if we fall into the water, he might even float." Whether this was a joke or not, the comfort of such seats was quite peculiar. Imagine sitting on a stiff laundry basket that vibrates at the speed of a dental drill. After an hour in the air, the intricate pattern of the weave pressed into your back and hips, even through the dense fabric of your suit. And because seatbelts were often absent in early models, passengers had to cling tightly to the woven armrests of these throne-like seats to avoid sliding into the aisle during sharp turns. But aviation was advancing rapidly, and competition was intensifying. Airlines understood that a wealthy customer couldn't be carried around on garden furniture for long. They needed to sell not just a means of moving through space, but a sense of exclusivity. Thus began an era that could be called a grand illusion for the eyes. Engineers and decorators faced a paradoxical challenge: to make the interior of the aircraft appear as a heavy, monumental, and secure home, yet weigh as lightly as a feather. The era of imitation had begun. If you look at promotional brochures from the 1930s, you'll see salons upholstered in what looks like heavy oak paneling or redwood. Passengers entered, ran their hands along the walls, and thought, quote 3. In reality, it was the thinnest plywood, veneer as thin as a sheet of paper, glued onto plywood or even cardboard. All of it wobbled, squeaked, and groaned with every gust of wind, but the eye was pleased. Curtains appeared. Oh, these were not mere sunshades. They were heavy velvet drapes with tassels and fringes, just like those in Victorian English drawing rooms or in first-class railway cars. Why such fuss about psychology? A person accustomed to the luxury of trains felt uneasy in a bare metal tube. They needed to create a cocoon, a familiar environment. The curtains also played an important role in another way. They concealed the view from the window. Let's be honest, the view from a 1930s aircraft window could induce panic, even in the most seasoned adventurer. You sat directly opposite the engine. You saw how the engine's casing trembled, how tongues of flame shot out of the exhaust pipes, something that was normal but looked like a catastrophe, and how the wing seemed to bend under the force of the wind. Therefore, flight attendants often discreetly offered, "Would you like to draw your curtains, madam? The sun is so bright today, and so you don't see that rivet coming loose," they thought silently. Replacing the woven chairs were real armchairs. They grew wider, deeper, padded with soft upholstery. Leather became the material of choice, and not just because it was expensive and luxurious. Leather had one undeniable advantage over velvet or fabric: it was easy to clean. The threat of air sickness was widespread, and practicality in the interior was just as important as aesthetics. The color schemes of these flying lounges also deserve mention. No bright, eye-catching shades like those of modern budget airlines. Everything was kept in sober, masculine tones: oak green, brown, burgundy, gray. This was meant to soothe, to create an atmosphere of a gentleman's club, where one could smoke a cigar and discuss stock quotes while the pilot battled a thunderstorm. The lighting inside the cabin was a story in itself. Electricity on board was scarce. Generators were weak, so instead of bright floodlighting, passengers had to make do with dim lamps that cast a yellow, sickly glow. Coupled with the tobacco smoke that hung heavy in the cabin like a yoke, the ventilation was as primitive as the heating. This created an atmosphere more akin to a mystical underground cellar than a heavenly vessel. Reading under such light was difficult. So many simply sat staring at one spot, or inspecting the pattern on the carpet. Yes, there were real wool carpets on the floor. They muted the sound of footsteps, although even a concrete bunker could not suppress the noise of engines, and they added warmth. Yet they became excellent dust collectors, absorbing every smell that filled the cabin, from spilled brandy to aviation fuel. Speaking of warmth and comfort, the engineers understood that a passenger freezing was a very angry passenger. But fully integrated climate control systems simply did not exist. Instead, heat was taken from where it was abundant, namely the engines. Hot air was channeled through a system of pipes into the cabin. It sounds logical, but there was one problem. The seal of these pipes often failed, and along with warmth, exhaust fumes and oil vapors would seep into the cabin. "I started to get a headache," a passenger complained. __quote_4__, Stewart reassured him, opening a small window. __quote_5__. At that moment, a blast of icy air at 150 kilometers per hour roared into the open window, blowing off hats, newspapers, and napkins. The passenger quickly closed the window and decided that a slight carbon monoxide poisoning was better than frostbite on the face. But let's return to the furniture. By the mid-30s, with the advent of giants like the Douglas DC-3, interiors truly became luxurious. Chairs were no longer just lined up in rows. They could now rotate. Tables for playing bridge appeared. Some airlines even installed typewriters in the cabins so that business travelers could work during the flight. Imagine a secretary trying to type a report while the plane plunges into an air pocket, dropping 30 meters. Every letter on the paper jumped like a frightened rabbit. Yet the height of absurdity and luxury was, of course, the sleeping quarters, which we will get to later. We will also show and describe what the cabin looked like during the day. It resembled a set from a theatrical play about aristocratic life. Everything was slightly unreal. The walls trembled, the floor vibrated, glasses on tables quivered slightly. But passengers pretended that everything was fine. It was the great social contract of that era. Passengers paid enormous sums, not for speed. Trains on medium distances were often faster, and not for safety. They paid for belonging to the caste of the divine, and the airplane interior had to match that status at any cost. Even the ladies' rooms and smoking lounges were finished with manic attention to detail. Gilded framed mirrors permanently fixed in place, starched towels embossed with the airline's monogram, small bouquets of flowers in little vases glued to the tables. All of it screamed __quote_6__. But as soon as the plane entered a turbulence zone, all this facade began to live its own life. Heavy curtains swayed like pendulums, reminding one of the laws of physics. Dishes clanged, and the passenger, clutching the armrest of his luxurious leather seat, suddenly felt a sharp realization. He was sitting in a fragile box, suspended in emptiness, separated from the abyss by just 3 millimeters of aluminum and a layer of beautiful walnut veneer. This contrast between external splendor and internal fragility created a peculiar sense of anxiety, an anxiety that couldn't be shown because gentlemen are not afraid. It was this hidden, suppressed fear that led passengers to seek salvation in the strangest of things. For example, their belief that something lies beneath their seat, something capable of saving their life should this flying palace decide to become a stationary object, gradually leads us to what was concealed beneath all this luxury, to the items that were not included in the promotional brochures, but which every passenger secretly checked by touch as soon as they sat down. These were fears, superstitions, and parachutes. Yes, parachutes. Today, when you settle into the seat of a modern airliner, you instinctively look for a life vest beneath the seat. You know it's there, or at least you sincerely hope so. But you never actually touch it. Back in the late 1920s, the situation was quite different. On some early passenger flights, especially those operated on converted mail planes, you might have been handed a real parachute. Imagine that scene. You're dressed in your best three-piece suit. Your companion wears a hat with a veil. A pilot approaches you, smelling of machine oil and tobacco, and extends a heavy canvas parachute with straps. Quote 7, you ask, eyeing the rough straps with disdain. Quote 8, the pilot replies philosophically. Quote 9. That was probably the most honest safety briefing in aviation history. No instructions, no warnings, just pull the mask toward your face or note the exits on the left and right. Everything was straightforward. Here's a silk bag, here's a ring. If the aircraft ceases to be an airplane and turns into a falling brick, your task is to open the door blocked by airflow, jump into the void in your model shoes, and pull the ring while praying to all known deities. Yet the airlines quickly learned one fundamental truth. The sight of a parachute does not calm a passenger. On the contrary, it plunges them into a state of quiet, icy terror. The presence of a parachute seemed to say, "We're not even sure this thing will make it." This was bad for ticket sales. Marketers, or those performing similar roles at the time, decided it was better to sell the illusion of absolute safety than real rescue equipment, which nobody would ever actually use. By the early 1930s, parachutes disappeared from the cabins. But the fear didn't go away. It simply hid deeper beneath velvet curtains and plywood panels. And it was this very fear that became the greatest enemy of sleep. Try to fall asleep when your brain, deprived of visual information, seeing only darkness or clouds outside, begins to listen intently. And what was there to listen to? Planes of those years were living organisms. They creaked, groaned, howled, and vibrated. Every new sound was interpreted by your imagination as the beginning of the end. That knocking on the left, surely a loose screw. A strange whistle on the right, definitely the fuselage is coming apart. And that drop downwards? Well, the pilot must have lost consciousness, and we're falling. The passenger lay in their seat, or on the shelf, if they were lucky, clutching a blanket with ghostly pale fingers, engaged in an endless dialogue with their instinct for self-preservation. "Sleep," the mind whispered. "We paid $300. Don't sleep," shouted the instinct. Did you hear that cracking sound? A particular kind of nightmare on the eve was thunderstorms. Modern liners are equipped with weather radars. They can fly around the front, over, or to the side of a storm. But the trimotor, or Curtiss Condoner, didn't have such luxuries. They flew low, straight through the clouds. When lightning flashed just a meter from the wing, illuminating the cabin with a ghostly, pallid light, even the most hardened cynics began to believe in higher powers. The religiosity aboard soared to extraordinary levels. People who on the ground hadn't thought about church in years suddenly started praying fervently at 30,000 feet. It was a logical response. Geographically, they had become closer to the heavens, so why not seize the opportunity for direct dialogue? Flight attendants, who arrived a little later, explained that their work during nighttime flights more closely resembled that of a psychotherapist or a priest. They found themselves holding the hand of grown, respectable men who cried out of fear with every turbulence jolt. "Everything's fine, sir. It's just a air pocket," the stewardess cooed, though she knew perfectly well that a bump could toss the plane downward by more than 50 meters. "Are you sure?" the trembling banker asked, clutching his pendant cross. "Absolutely," she replied. The captain had sent word that he had not seen such beautiful clouds in a long time, and he was pouring himself a second cup of coffee. That was a lie told for reassurance. Most likely, at that moment, the captain was fighting the yoke, pressing his feet against the instrument panel, uttering words that no Bible could contain. But beyond rational fears, superstition also reigned in the skies. Aviation, despite all its technological advances, had quickly accumulated myths worthy of medieval sailors. Have you heard of goblins? No, these are not the cute, fluffy creatures from movies. Originally, goblins are part of British pilot folklore, little malicious beings living inside the aircraft's mechanisms. They drink fuel, chew through wires, and love to cause trouble exactly when the plane is over the ocean or mountains. This myth seeped into the passenger cabins. Any unexplained knocking on the wing, which was constantly happening, trust me, was attributed to goblins. "Did you hear that?" whispered one passenger to another in the dark cabin, as if someone was sawing through the longeron with a handsaw. "Rubbish on your tongue. It's just the wind." No, wind doesn't sound like that. It's them. To protect themselves from these spirits and from fate itself, passengers brought talismans aboard. Lucky coins, rabbit's feet, photographs of beloved dogs. One famous opera singer refused to fly unless he was allowed to bring his childhood teddy bear into the cabin, with which he had slept since he was a child. And airline companies generally agreed. Who would argue with a paying customer willing to spend such money, even if he was a bit eccentric? Another source of fear was the very procedure of nighttime flying. In the 1930s, navigation often depended on light beacons, powerful projectors set on the ground every 15 to 20 kilometers. On clear nights, it looked beautiful, a dotted line of light stretching beyond the horizon. But in fog or rain, the beacons were invisible. A passenger looking out the window at only a gray gloom would start to panic. "We're lost," ran through their mind. "The pilot doesn't know where we are." Sometimes that was true. Pilots did wander. There were cases when planes descended to a glide to read the name of a railway station on a signboard. Imagine trying to fall asleep, and suddenly seeing the name Small Vasuki flash past outside the window, causing the station master to drop his lantern in fright. After that, only someone with nerves made of titanium alloy could fall asleep. And then there's the illusion of safety itself. The safety instructions we've become accustomed to, fasten your seatbelt, bring your seatbacks to the upright position, were practically non-existent. If seatbelts existed at all, they were regarded as an annoying nuisance. Many passengers refused to buckle up on principle. "I am a free citizen of a free country," declared some Texas oil man. "I won't be tied down like a criminal." Usually, this rebellion ended as soon as the plane hit a rough patch, when the free citizen was suddenly thrown upwards and slammed his head against the overhead compartment, which, by the way, was just a fabric-covered box, and hats and suitcases from other passengers would fall down on him. After such an incident, the belt was fastened so tightly that it left bruises on the stomach. Under these conditions, sleep became a series of snatched moments, stolen from the fear that refused to let go. It wasn't deep, restorative sleep, but a restless doze, like a soldier dozing in a trench. Any change in the engine's tone would immediately snap you awake, clutching the armrests. You lay in darkness, listening to the symphony of wind and metal, your imagination conjuring scenes more terrifying than the last. Now the wing might fall off. Now the engine might stall. Now the pilot might fall asleep. Speaking of pilots, the cockpit door was often left open or completely missing, replaced by a curtain, so the passengers in the front rows could see the crew. This was supposed to be reassuring, but more often it had the opposite effect. Seeing the pilot nervously smoking one cigarette after another, tapping a jammed instrument, or unfolding a massive paper map to figure out which state they were flying over, this spectacle was not for the faint of heart. "Look, Bill," whispered the wife to her husband. "Why is the captain crossing himself?" "Probably because we're flying over a church, dear. Go to sleep." But sleep was impossible. Adrenaline roiled through the blood, turning every minute into an hour, and the body, exhausted by fear, demanded relief. It needed to switch off, to drown out or soothe this stress. That's when the only thing capable of long-term comfort appeared, the one thing that could temporarily reconcile a passenger with reality. Food. But not just any food. An entire gastronomic ritual elevated to the level of absolute necessity. Because when you're chewing, you somehow can't be afraid. It's an ancient reflex, and airlines exploited it to the fullest. If fear was the constant background noise of flying in the 30s, then food became the main form of escapism. Airlines quickly realized a chewing passenger is a calm passenger. When your mouth is busy with chewing roasted chicken, you can't scream in terror, and the pleasant heaviness in your stomach distracts you from the thought that there's 3 kilometers of emptiness between you and the ground. Gastronomy on board evolved rapidly, almost as quickly as the engines themselves. It all started, as usual, in a Spartan fashion. In the late 20s, when you boarded a Ford 3 motor, the height of service was a cardboard box handed to you by the second pilot before takeoff, because stewardesses had not yet been invented. Inside this lunchbox was typically what could survive the jostling and temperature fluctuations. A cold roasted chicken leg, an apple, a couple of tired ham sandwiches whose freshness seemed to have been left on the runway, and perhaps a piece of chocolate cake. You were supposed to eat this right on your lap, trying not to spill greasy chicken on your Sunday trousers during the next turbulent bump. "Excuse me, Captain, but is there any coffee?" asked the passenger with hope. "Of course, sir," shouted the pilot. "There's a thermos back in the tail section. Just hold your cup with both hands." Today it's a bit shaky. But by the mid-30s, the situation had changed dramatically. Aviation entered its golden age, and food became not just fuel for the body, but a theatrical performance. Especially successful in this regard was the Pan American Company with their flying boats, the Clipper ships. Imagine you are flying over the Pacific Ocean. It's evening. The engines hum steadily and powerfully. Flight attendants are now these polished men in white jackets, often with experience from the finest hotels in New York, beginning to set the tables. And by tables, I mean real tables. The Clipper ships had a dedicated dining area. Passengers were invited to walk there in groups of several at a time. White, starched tablecloths appeared on the tables, genuine, with no plastic or paper. The dishes were fine porcelain with gold rims and the airline's logo. Utensils made of heavy silverware, glasses of crystal. It seemed as if the airlines deliberately defied the laws of physics, placing the most fragile and delicate items in the most unstable environment. The menu of that era could evoke envy in anyone dining at a modern Michelin-starred restaurant. For dinner, they served beef consommé, lobster thermidor, duck with orange sauce, roast beef, fresh asparagus, and for dessert, Melba peaches or elaborate pastries. Why such complexity? It's simple. The taste of food changes at high altitude. Due to the low pressure and dry air, our taste buds lose sensitivity. What seems normal on the ground becomes bland and flavorless in the sky, like cardboard. Intuitively, chefs of the 30s understood this and focused on rich, fatty, salty, and spicy dishes. However, serving such a dinner turned into a circus act with elements of acrobatics. The fiercest enemy of the steward was the soup. Attempting to serve hot soup on an aircraft bouncing through air pockets wasn't just a matter of service, but a daring challenge to gravity and common sense. "Your consommé, madam." The steward, balancing like a ballet dancer, placed the plate before the lady. At that exact second, the plane suddenly dived sharply. The liquid in the plate, obeying inertia, shot upward, forming a beautiful golden sphere in the air, then spilled over the lady's tablecloth and onto the steward himself. "Oh, sorry, it's all the wind," he said calmly, blotting the stain with a napkin. "I'll bring you some more while we're in a stable flow." That's why experienced passengers preferred ordering something solid and heavy that would stick to the plate under gravity, like a steak. But the main secret to passengers sleeping peacefully wasn't lobster or duck. The key was alcohol. At that time, attitudes towards spirits on board were, to put it mildly, liberal. Moreover, alcohol was a cornerstone of safety strategy, in a psychological sense. Airlines quickly discovered an interesting physiological effect. At an altitude of 2,000 to 3,000 meters, with mild hypoxia and oxygen deprivation, alcohol affects the human brain much faster and more strongly than on the ground. 1 glass of champagne in the sky was equivalent to 3 on land. Martini hit the head like a hammer wrapped in velvet. A passenger who had a couple of cocktails before dinner was already in a state of deep philosophical relaxation by the time dessert was served. The noise of the engines stopped being irritating and began to sound like a pleasant hum. The vibration of the chair transformed into a soothing massage, easing the tension in the body. Thoughts of potential disaster dissolved into a haze of euphoria. The flight attendants were well aware of this and did not hold back. The cocktail menu was extensive. "Would you like more whiskey, sir?" "Certainly, dear sir." "Something seems to be causing excessive movement on one wing. I need to stabilize the horizon." It was a kind of anesthesia. Passengers were literally rocked to sleep by alcohol, so they would rest more quickly and not disturb the crew with their fears. Besides, a drunken passenger was less likely to complain about the cold or uncomfortable seat. They would simply curl up under a blanket, snoring loudly, sometimes drowning out the hum of the engines. Of course, there were occasional mishaps. Some free spirits, overestimating their strength, would begin to cause trouble, trying to storm into the cockpit or open the front door to air out the cabin. But such disturbances were quickly subdued, either by themselves, the passengers, or by the stout stewards, many of whom had once been medics or military personnel. After dinner, a ritual to prepare for sleep would begin, which was also closely linked to drinking. This time, it was tobacco. Today, it sounds wild, but in the 30s, 40s, and even later, smoking on board was not just allowed, it was considered an essential part of the glamorous life. After a hearty meal, the cabin would sink into a bluish mist. Gentlemen would produce cigars, and ladies would light thin cigarettes. Ventilation in airplanes of those years, as we have mentioned, was minimal at best. Smoke would hang in thick layers, mixing with the scent of grilled meat, perfumes, gasoline, and leather upholstery. This aroma of luxury permeated clothing, hair, and even, it seemed, the very soul of the traveler. Yet no one complained. On the contrary, the glow of a cigarette in the semi-darkness of the cabin created a cozy atmosphere. It felt so homely. "Would you like a light?" asked a neighbor, leaning over the aisle. At that moment the plane lurched, and the glowing ash from the cigar fell onto the carpet. "Careful!" someone shouted. "We'll burn ourselves!" The fear of fire was real, given that the aircraft was made of fabric, wood, and magnesium alloys, with fuel tanks located very close by. But the desire to smoke was stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. Ashtrays were built into the armrests of each seat, and the stewards regularly walked through the cabin, emptying them into a special metal container. And so, dinner was finished, glasses drained, cigars smoked to the end. The lights in the cabin dimmed. Now came the moment for which this chapter was crafted, the transition from wakefulness to sleep. The passenger's body, having received a hefty dose of calories and alcohol, begins to demand rest. Eyes grow heavy. But here, the cunning physiology, rarely written about in menus, begins to play its part. You've just eaten heartily and drunk. You are in a confined space that constantly changes altitude, plunging into air pockets. Your vestibular system, already slightly dulled by alcohol, starts to wake up and send alarming signals to the brain. A mixture of fatty goose, champagne, tobacco smoke, and turbulence creates inside the stomach a perfect storm. Ironically, the very remedy, the food and drink meant to soothe the passenger, becomes, after about an hour, the cause of his greatest distress. As the stewardesses clear away the dishes, they prepare the next, no less glamorous set of accessories: paper bags. They knew the second act of this nocturnal performance was about to begin. The faces of passengers, just recently flushed from brandy, would soon take on that distinctive pale greenish hue that would give its name to the next chapter. For now, everything remains quiet. The passenger is well fed, not exhausted, and trying to settle more comfortably into their seat, hoping that sleep will come before their stomach demands to be emptied again. And then, at last, the moment of truth arrives. That inevitable phase when physics and biology clash in a fierce battle. Your body, spoiled by champagne and lobster, suddenly realizes it is not a bird, but a complex system of tubes and fluids that has not evolved to hang out inside an aluminum tubes at 3,000 meters above the ground. Welcome to the world of altitude sickness, where your neighbor's complexion shifts from a noble pallor to a worried olive tone faster than Stuart can clear the dessert plates. To grasp the scale of this tragedy, one must remember how airplanes flew in that era. Modern liners ascend to 10 or 12 kilometers into the stratosphere, where the air is as calm as water in a pond. Aircraft like the Ford Model 3 More, the Douglas DC-2, or the Boeing 247 flew at altitudes where weather lived. They crawled at heights of about 1.5 to 3 kilometers, pushing through the densest rising and sinking air currents. For the airplane, this was normal working territory. For the passenger, it was an endless fall in an elevator whose cable had snapped, followed by a sudden jolt upward, for hours. "Madam, you have turned pale," a fellow passenger would kindly note, clutching the armrests so tightly that his knuckles blanched. "Oh no, everything's fine," the lady would reply, trembling as she tried to straighten up. It was just that the oysters had seemed too fresh. But that was a lie. The oysters weren't to blame. The real culprit was the vestibular system. The inner ear was going haywire, sending panic signals to the brain. "We're falling, we're tumbling, get rid of the ballast immediately." And the stomach, obedient as a soldier, obeyed the command. That's why, in the earliest days of aviation, the first flight attendants weren't models or waitresses, but licensed nurses. It was a strict requirement from Elin Church, the world's first stewardess. She had to be able not only to smile and carry a tray, but also to handle ammonia inhalants professionally, check a pulse, and, most importantly, not faint at the sight of the aftermath of affluent gentlemen's meals. In the 30s, the smell inside an airplane cabin was a unique perfume nightmare. Imagine this bouquet: a sharp, sweetish scent of aviation gasoline, the sealant of the fuel system being only semi-effective, hot engine oil, the smoke of pricey cigars, aromas of fine cuisine, and, like a cherry on top, the sour smell of seasickness that couldn't be fully aired out of the velvety upholstery of the seats. "Miss?" A strained cry from a passenger in the third row. "Quick!" And the stewardess hurried. In her hands was not the neat, laminated paper bag we see today. Oh no. The evolution of the nausea bag deserves a dissertation all on its own. In the 20s, passengers were issued small buckets, either aluminum or cardboard, similar to those used for popcorn today. Picture this: a cabin full of society's elite, with every second person clutching a bucket pressed to their chest like a priceless treasure. The problem with these buckets was that during turbulence, which is exactly what prompted their use, the contents often spilled out. This caused a chain reaction. One passenger would start to vomit, unable to contain it, and the smell would spread through the cabin. Within minutes, others would join in, forming a rolling tide of discomfort. Later, cardboard boxes appeared, resembling packaging for takeout Chinese food. They were called burb cups, or burp cups, although the name was too delicate for their true purpose. It wasn't until the late 30s that hermetically sealed paper bags were invented. This invention saved the dignity of thousands. For the passenger of that era, the most terrifying aspect of air sickness wasn't the physical discomfort, but the social shame. You are a banker, an owner of factories and ships, dressed in a suit worth $200. Across from you sits your competitor, or worse, a beautiful woman. And suddenly, your body betrays you in the most humiliating way. Flight attendants, or stewardesses, performed remarkable feats. They could appear beside the unfortunate just moments before a catastrophe, shield him from curious eyes, slip a rescue bag and a damp cloth into his hand, then vanish unnoticed, taking the evidence with them. "Are you feeling better, Mr. Smith?" the girl asked, wiping the sufferer's forehead with a cold cloth. "Here, smell the lemon, or maybe some peppermint. Lemon, please," the green Mr. Smith whispered in response. "And tell everyone I was just contemplating the annual report." Methods for combating motion sickness were quite varied. Besides peppermint and lemon, passengers were offered chewing gum. It was believed that chewing equalized pressure in the ears and calmed the stomach. The Wrigley Company even produced a special aviation chewing gum called K, which was handed out free before takeoff. The whole cabin chewed in unison. This was the only breach of etiquette that everyone forgave. Some airlines went further and offered oxygen to their passengers. Personal masks appeared later, but in the 30s, a stewardess might approach with a rubber tube connected to a wall-mounted tank. "Breathe deeply, sir. It will clear your head." The passenger inhaled pure oxygen through the tube, which resembled a hookah, and within a few minutes, he actually felt relief. The main thing was not to think about whose lips had touched that mouthpiece 10 minutes earlier. The world seemed to stop spinning. Colors grew brighter. But as soon as the tube was taken away, nausea returned with renewed force. Now, imagine how difficult it was to sleep under such conditions. Trying to doze during severe turbulence was a special kind of refined challenge. You lie on your luxurious bunk, whether it's a sleeping dory or Curtis. Curtains are drawn, darkness prevails, and this only worsens the situation. Your eyes cannot see the horizon, and your brain loses its last point of support. Do you feel like the plane is spiraling into a spin? Do you feel like it's flying upside down? Every cell in your body screams in alarm. You close your eyes, but everything spins before your mind's eye. You open them and see only the trembling fabric of the curtain. Many passengers preferred not to lie down at all, even if they paid for a sleeping berth. They sat in semi-reclining seats, feet flat on the floor, trying to ground themselves. "I can't lie down," complained a passenger to the stewardess. "As soon as I get into a horizontal position, I feel like I've been hammered into a barrel and thrown over the Nagar River waterfall." "Oh, come now, sir, such dark allegories," she smiled. "Would you like some more gum?" The nighttime flight's soundscape added a special touch of luxury. Through the roar of the engines, distinctly characteristic, very specific sounds occasionally pierced through. These were the sounds of other passengers suffering. Someone groaned, another coughed loudly, and yet another called out sharply for the stewardess, while someone else produced that unmistakable sound that no one could mistake, a sound that instantly triggered nausea in everyone nearby. It was a chain reaction within the confined space of the cabin. One weak passenger could incapacitate half the crew. That's why seasoned travelers carried not only earplugs, but also handkerchiefs soaked in medicated alcohol or menthol oil. They would sleep, or try to sleep, pressing the cloth to their noses, creating a tiny breathing bubble around themselves. Yet, despite this vestibular torment, people continued to fly. Why? Because the alternative was a week on a train, because time was money, and because humans are astonishingly resilient creatures. By morning, when the turbulence usually subsided, the cabin resembled a battlefield. Pale, exhausted faces lined with dark circles under their eyes, clutching empty chewing gum packets and used cough drops, gazed out the windows at dawn. They had survived the night. Their bodies had endured, and when the stewardess, fresh and alert as she always seemed, perhaps because she was a cyborg, walked down the aisles with steaming towels, passengers looked at her as if she were an angel of salvation. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are approaching Amaryllis." Outside the window, the temperature. They didn't care what the temperature was. The main thing was that Earth was close. Solid, unmoving, beautiful Earth. But there was still a long way to go before landing, and in the meantime, passengers would face yet another problem they might have forgotten amid their struggles with their stomachs and the cold. Because night at altitude isn't only dark and frightening, it's also freezing cold. And no heating system from the 30s could handle that. Prepare your fur coats. We are entering the zone of eternal frost. Now imagine, your stomach has finally agreed to a ceasefire with your vestibular system. The turbulence has died down, or have you simply gotten used to it? Like a sailor acclimates to the rocking of the ship, you wipe the cold sweat from your brow, lean back in your seat, or adjust the pillow on your bunk thinking, well, the worst is over. Now I can sleep. Oh, how naive. You've forgotten where you are. You are inside an aluminum tube with walls only a few millimeters thick, traveling at 200 kilometers per hour at 3,000 meters altitude. Outside, it's 20 below, or even 30 below Celsius. And that tube, to put it plainly, is full of holes. Welcome to the era of freezing comfort. If in the advertising brochures of airlines from the 30s they described the cabin atmosphere as warm and cozy, they only meant the color of the upholstery on the seats. Physically, the atmosphere inside the cabin more closely resembled a poorly ventilated barn during a February snowstorm. Ceiling, as we remember, did not exist. This meant the air inside was just as thin and icy as outside. Insulation? Well, a layer of special material, similar to cotton batting, was placed between the outer shell and the inner plywood. But its main purpose was to muffle noise somewhat. It did little to retain heat. It was as effective as a fishing net is at holding water. So when the airplane climbed to cruising altitude, the cabin plunged into an ice age. Inside, windows became covered with intricate frost patterns. If you accidentally touched the bare metal fuselage with your hand, you risked sticking to it like a curious schoolboy's tongue to winter swings. Passengers strolled through the aisle with such force that they could turn the pages of a newspaper you held in your hands. Airlines, of course, understood the problem well. A frozen passenger was a dissatisfied passenger, and the next time they might choose to travel by train instead. Therefore, efforts to keep passengers warm were fought with varying degrees of success, and sometimes with rather barbaric methods. The primary approach was heating from the engine. Engineers reasoned logically. We have enormous motors that produce a tremendous amount of heat. Why not put that heat to use? They installed sheaths around the exhaust pipes. The air inside heated up and was channeled through pipes into the cabin. It sounded brilliant in theory. In practice, it resembled a branch of a chemical plant with a heating system. Metal heat exchangers would crack from vibration and noise, and along with the desired warmth, the exhaust gases, rich in carbon monoxide, would start flowing into the cabin. "Steward, what does that smell like?" a passenger would ask, wrinkling their nose as they wrapped themselves in a blanket. "It smells like we're in a garage," Steward cheerfully replied. "That's the smell of progress, sir," he would add. opening a ventilation hatch which instantly blasted a stream of icy air into the cabin, cooling everything down in an instant. That's how they flew, either warm, but with the risk of suffocation and waking up dead, or cold, but with the chance of turning into an ice sculpture. Carbon monoxide was a treacherous enemy. It has no color or smell. The smell was mostly of oil and gasoline, but it caused a very pleasant, gentle sleepiness. Passengers would close their eyes, thinking they had finally relaxed, but in reality, their brains were beginning to suffer from oxygen deprivation, intensified by toxins. The second method was individual insulation. Since heating the air proved impossible, they decided to heat the passenger instead. Each passenger was given a heavy wool blanket, but it wasn't enough. During winter flights, especially over northern states or mountain ranges, travelers were offered foot bags, fur-lined bags for the feet. You would slip your feet into these fur-lined mittens up to your waist, then put on a coat and wear a hat. Yes, passengers sat in the cabin wearing hats and tried to sleep like that. Sleeping compartments on aircraft such as the Kritz-Kaunder or Douglas Sleeper Transport were equipped with dense curtains, not only for privacy, but also to keep the warmth in. Inside such a compartment, breathing was easier, but as soon as you poked your nose outside, the cold would nip at it immediately. But cold was only half the problem. The other half was altitude. Today, the pressure inside an aircraft cabin is maintained at a level equivalent to an altitude of 1,000 to 2,000 meters, even when flying at 10,000 meters. Back in the 1930s, the pressure inside the cabin matched the outside pressure, and to cross the Rocky Mountains, you had to ascend to 3.5 or even 4,000 meters. At this altitude, the air becomes treacherously thin. The oxygen content drops by about a third compared to sea level. For a healthy person sitting calmly, this wasn't fatal, but it was felt. For someone tired, intoxicated, recall the previous chapters, and frightened, it became a serious test. Hypoxia, or oxygen deficiency, is a cunning thing. It doesn't cause pain. On the contrary, its early stages bring euphoria. The passenger feels lightness, an inexplicable happiness. They want to laugh. They become cheerful and foolish. Critical thinking shuts down. "Look at the amusing clouds," a solid businessman chuckled as he gazed out the window. "I want to walk among them and buy them to develop real estate." "Sit still, sir," gently urged the stewardess. "We're going to take a walk in Los Angeles." But after euphoria came apathy, sluggishness, and that heavy, leaden sleep. And that sleep was dangerous. Please like and subscribe to Lectures Under the Moon for more fascinating content. In a dream, breathing slows down, and at altitude, it becomes even more sluggish. A person could simply forget to take a breath. To combat this, airlines began installing oxygen systems, but no masks had yet been designed to automatically drop into place. The system resembled a smoky bar. Along the walls ran tubes, and each seat was equipped with an individual Mundschutz, or mask, that had to be pressed to the face. Imagine a sleeping cabin at night. Dimmed lights, silence broken only by the roar of engines. Dozens of people lay under blankets, each with a rubber tube protruding from their mouth into the wall. A scene straight out of a science fiction film about cyborgs. Sleeping with a tube in your mouth was uncomfortable. It would fall out, it would dry up, but without it, you'd wake up with a heavy head, as if you'd drunk a barrel of cheap whiskey the night before, even if you hadn't drunk anything at all. And here, stepping onto the stage, was the main character of this drama, the stewardess. It was during overnight flights at high altitude that her medical training became critically important. While the passengers slept, these delicate young women became guardian angels, making endless rounds. The stewardess had a clear instruction: Monitor the color of the sleeping passengers' faces. In the dim glow of night lamps, they scrutinized their faces. So, Mr. Johnson was pink. Good. Mrs. Smith was pale, but breathing steadily. And what about this gentleman in the fifth row? Why are his lips blue? The bluish color of lips and nails, cyanosis, is a sure sign of acute hypoxia. The stewardess immediately woke such a passenger. "Sir, please wake up." The frightened passenger would sit up, asking, "What are we falling?" "No, sir, you just forgot to breathe. Take the tube, take a couple of deep breaths," the stewardess would reply. The passenger, greedily gulping oxygen, would regain his composure, surprised to find his heart pounding wildly and his head pounding like a hammer. "Thank you, miss. I had such a strange dream." "You're welcome. Try not to sleep on your back, sir." It was especially hard on children and the elderly. For them, the altitude was a genuine risk factor. There were cases when, after landing, it was discovered that a passenger had suffered a heart attack in his sleep, triggered by the height and the cold. That's why airlines in the early days insisted on medical certificates from passengers, although the wealthy often ignored this requirement. By morning, the cabin grew particularly cold. The metal shell of the aircraft had fully cooled overnight. Water in the carafes formed a layer of ice. Toothpaste in tubes turned to stone. To get it out, passengers had to exert effort worthy of a weightlifter. Waking up, they saw steam escaping from their mouths. Changing from pajamas back into their suits became a frantic survival challenge. No one wanted to leave the warmth of their blankets. "Ladies and gentlemen, in 30 minutes we will land for refueling," announced the pilot. The temperature in the cabin had dropped slightly. "We apologize," the announcement said, with slightly meaning that your tooth no longer fits into its socket. Passengers pulled on everything they could: sweaters, vests, coats over their jackets. Ladies even wore 2 pairs of stockings. It looked more like a refugee gathering than an elite club of travelers. Yet the most surprising thing was that, despite the freezing cold and oxygen deprivation, many recalled these flights with warmth. There was something heroic about it. Overcoming the elements, the camaraderie of people who had endured a night in the icy desert of the sky. "Remember how we froze over the Rocky Mountains in '35, one millionaire would say to another in the club. "Back then I nearly lost my nose." Yes, those were glorious times. Not like now. I would sit down, fall asleep, wake up, and feel bored. But cold and altitude weren't the only enemies of our nighttime rest. There was another factor we, wrapped in fur coats, had temporarily put aside. A factor that couldn't be turned off, couldn't be ignored, and from which no blanket could save us. Sound. You think you know what a loud noise is. You've been at a rock concert. You've stood next to a jackhammer. Forget it. That's all just whispering compared to what the passenger heard while trying to sleep, half a meter from 3 radial engines running at full throttle. Prepare your cotton. We are about to enter the loudest chapter of our story. In today's world, we're used to complaining about noise. We get annoyed by a crying baby in the next row, a loud phone conversation, or the roar of turbines during takeoff. We put on noise-canceling headphones, turn on relaxing music, and block out reality. But a passenger from 1930 would look at our problems with a bitter smile. For him, silence was as unreachable a luxury as teleportation. If cold was an enemy that crept up unnoticed and bit from beneath, noise hammered you with a sledgehammer from the moment the engine started and didn't stop for a second until the propellers settled on the ground. To understand the scale of this catastrophe, let's look at the numbers. Inside a modern Boeing, the noise level is about 80 decibels. That's comparable to the noise of a busy street or a loud conversation. In a Ford Model 3M or early Fokker aircraft, The noise level was consistently around 110, sometimes even 120 decibels. What is 120 decibels? It's the sound of a jackhammer working just a meter from your ear. It's the roar of a chainsaw. It's the volume of a rock concert where you stand directly next to the speakers. Now imagine that this concert lasts not 2 hours, but 12, and you can't leave, and you still need to sleep. The source of this acoustic nightmare was obvious. Engines from that era had no mufflers. Exhaust gases escaped straight from the cylinders into the atmosphere, creating a monstrous clatter. But that was only half the problem. The main source of noise was the propellers themselves. At high speeds, the tips of the blades approached the speed of sound, producing a continuous series of tiny sonic booms. Now think about the aircraft's construction. The Ford Model 3M was rightly called a tin goose. Its fuselage was made of corrugated aluminum. This material had an astonishing property. It acted as a membrane of a giant drum. Vibrations from the engines transmitted to the body, turning the entire aircraft into one large resonator that amplified the sound. When the pilot pushed the throttle to full, conversation in the cabin became physically impossible. You could scream directly into your neighbor's ear, straining your vocal cords, but he would only see your lips moving. "How do you like the flight?" shouted a gentleman, breathless from exertion. "What?" shouted the passenger next to him. "I said, the weather is excellent." "No, thank you. I don't want water." This led to the emergence of a unique in-flight culture. Passengers quickly resorted to sign language or wrote notes. In the pockets of their seats, besides hygiene bags, they often carried notebooks and pencils. It was the only way to communicate. "Wake me up when we reach Chicago. Your hat fell on my foot. It looks like that engine is on fire." These were typical text messages from that era, scribbled with trembling hands. Shaking in the literal sense, because the second component of the symphony was vibration. It was everywhere. It seeped through the soles of shoes, through the armrests of seats, through the cushions. The airplane trembled with a faint, unpleasant shudder that made teeth start to ache. If you opened your mouth and tried to produce a sound, it would turn into a fragmented squeal. Vibration made reading impossible. Letters in a newspaper jumped before your eyes, causing a headache after just 5 minutes. Drinking from a cup without spilling the contents was an art accessible only to select circus performers and seasoned crew members. But the most frightening effect of the vibration was on sleep. Try to fall asleep when your bed is mounted on a washing machine on the spin cycle. Your body cannot relax. Muscles involuntarily tense up, trying to compensate for the shaking. Even if you managed to drift into unconsciousness, it was not deep sleep, but a shallow, exhausting doze. Airlines, of course, knew about this problem, and their methods of fighting noise were tenderly naive. We already mentioned cotton. It was a universal remedy. Before takeoff, a stewardess would walk down the aisles with a large silver bowl or a basket filled with cotton balls. "Remember to protect your ears, sir." Passengers obediently stuffed cotton into their ear cavities. Did it help? Slightly. It reduced the sharpness of the high frequencies, but the low-frequency hum, felt through the diaphragm and the bones of the skull, persisted. It was physically tangible. It pressed against the chest. In some advanced airlines, such as Imperial Airways, which flew from London to colonies, more sophisticated devices like rubber plugs or even semblances of headphones were handed out. But they were uncomfortable, pressed on the ears, and hindered side sleeping. Another way to combat noise was through cabin insulation. Engineers discovered that bare metal vibrated the loudest, so the walls were covered with thick layers of fabric, leather, or velour. Under the lining, they packed in the same material, plant-based fluff or wool felt. This somewhat dampened the vibration of the walls, but the noise level still remained beyond what was tolerable for normal life. And in this environment, you had to spend the night. Humans are adaptive creatures. After an hour or two, the brain, realizing that this roar was not going to stop, began to filter it. The noise transformed into white noise, a dense wall of sound behind which thoughts could hide. Some passengers claimed that this monotonous hum even lulled them to sleep. "You know," confided one veteran of flights, "when I returned home after a trip from New York to Los Angeles, I couldn't sleep that first night. It was too quiet in the bedroom. The silence itself was ringing in my ears. I had to turn on the fan just to create some sort of background noise." But there were also those for whom the symphony of engines became a true mental ordeal. The continuous low-frequency hum evoked feelings of anxiety, inexplicable fear, and aggression. By the middle of the night, many passengers became irritable. The slightest thing, a nudge in the seatback, a sidelong glance, could provoke a conflict. Flight attendants had to act as peacekeepers in what felt like a war zone where no one could hear anyone else. "Sir, please calm down," she would shout, trying to outshout the roar of 3 engines. "He's snoring," a passenger would shout back, pointing at his neighbor. And here was another irony of the situation. Amid such monstrous noise, people somehow managed to hear their brave neighbor. Why? Because bravery, the human, irregular sound, stands out from the monotonous drone of the engines, and our brains pick it out from the mechanical, uniform hum. In the 30s, bravery aboard an aircraft often became a source of genuine hatred, as it shattered the fragile illusion of silence that each person built inside their mind. The most intense acoustic environment occurred during landing, when the pilot reduced power and the engines shifted to idle. Suddenly, the cabin was not silent, but filled with the whistling of the wind. One could hear the fuselage creaking, the flaps clicking, and the heavy breathing of the passenger sitting on the right. This transition from silence to whistling often startled travelers more sharply than any alarm clock. It felt as if the engines had failed, and the sensation of falling quietly took over. "We're falling in whispers now, so we can whisper, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 25, underscore, underscore. No, we're just gliding," reassured the seasoned veteran. "A hit's coming. Keep your jaw from biting your tongue." "Excuse me, sir. Please, ma'am, be careful. Don't step on the edge." "Stewart, may I have another pillow? My teeth are chattering." "Of course, sir. Try placing your hand under your cheek. It helps cushion the shock. Please do not unfasten the belt while sleeping, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 33, underscore, underscore. If we hit a downward draft, I don't want to find you hanging from the ceiling. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 34, underscore, underscore. Are you staying long, sir? I'm trying to unfasten my suspenders, damn them all. Darling, are you alive? I got my sleeve caught in the luggage net, and I think my leg's cramping. I can afford a ticket costing $300. I am at home here. I love you. What, you want to sleep? Upper bunk versus lower bunk. Steward, I think the ceiling is pressing down on me. That's just an optical illusion, sir. And please, close your eyes. It will be easier. Hey, up there! Are you tap dancing up there? Have some decency. Sorry, I'm just trying to find a comfortable position. My elbow is pressing against the frame. Damn it! See, I haven't neglected my grooming, even in the face of the elements. Water was also a problem. The reservoirs were small. By morning, water often ran out or froze if the flight was at a high altitude. In the best cases, it trickled out in a thin, miserable stream. In the worst, the tap emitted a harsh rasp and spat out a cloud of rusty dust, so washing often turned into wiping the face with a damp towel. Forget about a proper shower. Even on luxurious clipper planes, showers were rare and used by only a few due to water shortages. Passengers simply refreshed themselves, generously dousing themselves with cologne to mask the lack of water procedures. Now, let's move on to the most delicate subject, the toilet. In the early days of aviation, the toilet was essentially a bucket with a lid or a straight pipe leading outside. During flight, this created a terrible draft and whistling noise. Opening the lid would expose you to a blast of icy air from below. There was a legend that if you threw a piece of paper in, it would be sucked into the engine. But that was just a scare for novices. By the late 30s, chemical toilets with a flush system using blue liquid, an ancestor of modern designs, appeared. This was a giant step forward, but soundproofing was still absent. Flushing in an airplane toilet produced a noise capable of waking even a deaf person. In the cramped space, it resonated like a cannon shot. Every passenger in the cabin knew exactly when their neighbor pressed the pedal. This completely destroyed any sense of privacy. The queue for the toilet was the center of social life on an early morning flight. People stood in a narrow corridor, clutching the backs of seats with towels draped over their shoulders and tissues in their hands. They were disheveled, sleepy, dressed in robes. "Good morning, Mr. Astor. How did you sleep on the upper berth?" "Horribly. I dreamt I was locked inside barrels and taken down a non-argon waterfall. And you?" "I spent the whole night listening to your suspenders knocking against your beard." This line in the queue blurred social boundaries. Bankers, actresses, politicians, all were equal before the closed door marked occupied. Everyone moved in the same way, shifting weight from one foot to the other whenever the plane tilted. Each passenger equally despising the person seated inside for those 20 minutes. The women had the hardest time. If the men's restroom was Spartan, the women's tried to imitate a boudoir. There was a small footstool bolted to the floor, a vase with artificial flowers, and more mirrors. Applying makeup in turbulence was an art bordering on magic. Imagine trying to line your lips with lipstick while the plane jostled, causing the red line to drift toward your ear. Trying to define your eyes with mascara, risking poking yourself in the eye. Such was the challenge. That's why the makeup of female travelers in the 30s was often bold and expressive. Slightly more colorful cheeks, a little less precise eyeliner, yet no one paid much attention. The main goal was to keep the face intact, literally. Another challenge was stockings. Putting on silk stockings and fastening them to a belt in a cramped, vibrating cabin without ripping them or hitting your head on the door was an acrobatic feat. A run in a stocking was a common tragedy of the morning flight, capable of ruining the mood for the entire day. Meanwhile, as passengers struggled with their routines, stewardesses performed logistical miracles. They had to not only prepare breakfast, but also reset the cabin swiftly. As soon as a passenger left their berth and headed to the restroom, Stewart would jump into action. Bedding was torn away, mattresses rolled up and stuffed into storage compartments. The upper bunk was lifted and snapped into the ceiling. The lower seats returned to an upright position, all in a frantic rush. The passenger re-emerged from the bathroom, smelling of lavender and tobacco, only to find that their sleeping space had vanished. Instead, a regular chair stood in its place, with coffee steaming on the table and toast already laid out. "Your breakfast, sir. Scrambled eggs." Scrambled eggs X was the most popular aviation dish, not because it was loved, but because it was easiest to prepare and eat amidst the turbulence. Even if it fell off the fork, it didn't leave disastrous stains like soft-boiled eggs. Breakfast was the final act of the morning ritual. Passengers gradually woke up, coffee and nicotine doing their work. No one canceled the morning cigarette. Life slowly regained order. The fears of the night receded beneath the bright morning sun flooding the cabin. People began to freshen up. Men adjusted their ties, women put on hats. In those days, hats were mandatory. Exiting the plane without a hat was unthinkable. The bustle of preparations soon filled the cabin. Someone looked for a glove that had fallen under a seat. Another tried to cram a pajama set into a small suitcase, which, strangely, now took up twice the space it had the day before. A stewardess moved along the rows with a tray of lozenges or chewing gum, intended to prevent ear pressure during descent, she explained. Descending was painful. No sealant, sharp pressure differences. Ears didn't just feel blocked, they throbbed with pain. Experienced passengers knew the trick. Pinch your nose, close your mouth, and blow out forcefully. Valsalva maneuver. The entire cabin would turn red with puffed cheeks and wide eyes, which looked comically exaggerated but was the only relief from temporary deafness. And then, finally, the earth appeared. The wheels hitting the runway, or the hull touching water if it was a flying boat, changed the tone entirely. The plane sped along the runway, slowing down, bouncing over uneven terrain, and finally coming to a halt. The propellers stopped, and silence fell. That silence was deafening. After 12 hours of relentless noise, the ears refused to process the absence of sound. Passengers exchanged glances, smiling with strange, slightly manic grins. They had survived. They were still here. The door swung open, and a rush of fresh air poured into the cabin, carrying the scent of grass and earth. It was the finest smell in the world. Passengers stood up, massaging their cramped limbs. They looked nothing like the polished images in magazines. Their suits were wrinkled, eyes red, hair slightly disheveled. Yet their posture radiated pride. They were conquerors of the skies. They had undertaken a journey that, just 10 years earlier, would have seemed like pure fantasy. They descended the gangway, waving to those waiting, posing for the photographer, like, "Good flight, Mr. Rockefeller." Mr. Rockefeller, however, was utterly convinced that the flight was marvelous, only longing to reach a proper bath and a still bed. The service had surpassed all praise, and he wasn't entirely wrong. The service truly was heroic. It was upheld by the shoulders of those we have mentioned in every chapter, but never examined closely enough. These people, flight attendants, celestial maidens, transformed this flying lumber with engines into something akin to a hotel in the sky. They were nannies, waitresses, nurses, psychologists, and cleaners all rolled into one. How did they survive under such conditions? Where did they sleep? And did they sleep at all? And why, in the 30s, was being a flight attendant considered the most prestigious, yet most brutal career for a woman? In the next chapter, we will peek behind the curtain into a tiny service compartment and uncover the truth about those whose smiles were an obligatory part of the uniform, even if the plane was plummeting. If in the 30s pilots were gods dwelling on Olympus in the cockpit, then flight attendants were angels, descended into the purgatory of the cabin to save the souls of sinners, that is, the passengers. Today, we mostly see flight attendants as safety specialists who occasionally serve tomato juice. But the celestial maidens, dubbed Sky Girls in the headlines of that era, were a phenomenon of an entirely different order. They were a unique blend of nurse, maid, waitress, psychotherapist, and baggage handler, all in skirts that fell below the knee, with a smile glued to their faces as if by superglue. Let's immediately demolish the main myth. Working as a flight attendant during the golden age of aviation was not a glamorous walk in the clouds. It was grueling labor on a vibrating floor. Everything started with Ella Charles in 1930. She convinced the management of Boeing Air Transport that having a woman on board was not a bad omen, but a brilliant marketing move. The logic was ironclad: ruthlessly striking at male egos. If this girl didn't faint from fright, then, as a stern businessman, I certainly shouldn't hide under my seat. The requirements for candidates were stricter than for Hollywood actresses. No older than 25, weighing no more than 115 pounds, standing no taller than 5 feet 2 inches, since ceilings were low, marital status strictly unmarried, and most importantly, possessing a nurse's diploma. Why a diploma? Because during the flight, she'd have to do everything, from taking a frightened banker's pulse to assisting with childbirth. Such cases did happen. But when night fell and passengers settled into their expensive beds, the most demanding shift for the flight attendant began. She became the night sentinel. Imagine, the cabin plunged into darkness. The hum of engines presses against the ears, passengers sleep behind curtains, and the celestial girl sits on a foldable chair at the tail of the plane, in the loudest and coldest spot. She has no right to fall asleep. Her task is to listen. She had to distinguish the breath of the engines from the cabin's atmosphere. If someone fumbled in their sleep, she needed to be there within 3 seconds. If someone coughed, a glass of water should already be in her hand. "Miss, I'm scared," whispered a pale old woman behind the curtain, flying for the first time to visit her grandchildren. The stewardess couldn't just say, "Everything will be fine." She had to crouch on the vibrating floor, take the passenger's cold hand into her palms, and sit like that for an hour until she calmed down. "Look, ma'am, the wing is intact. Pilot Jack is the best in the state. Once he landed a plane in fog on a football field without even waking the cows. True story, completely true." Sleep. Her duties also included poking and prodding, tucking. It was almost a maternal gesture. As she moved through the cabin, she adjusted blankets, tucking them under the sides of sleeping passengers so they wouldn't fall during a tilt. She made sure the seat belts were fastened over the blankets. If the belt wasn't visible, she had to delicately feel for it in the darkness, trying not to wake or frighten the passenger. Men, especially, were a major source of nerve consumption. Alcohol, altitude, and a beautiful girl in uniform created a dangerously explosive mix. Some gentlemen, having taken too much, started confusing the plane with a nightclub. "Hey, honey, bring me more whiskey and sit with me," slurred a oil worker. The stewardess had to defuse the conflict without losing the dignity of the airline or receiving complaints. "Sir, the bar is closed due to technical reasons. The altitude affects the taste of whiskey. It becomes toxic." She would then check the temperature in the pilot's cabin. "Good night," she'd say, and leave, leaving the gentleman to ponder the treachery of physics. But beyond psychological support, there was also harsh physics. Who, do you think, bolted the seats to the floor if they became loose? The stewardess. Who carried heavy trays of food? The stewardess. Who emptied buckets from the early models of aircraft? Yes, exactly her. The very fairy in white gloves. In aircraft like the Douglas DST, there was only one stewardess for the entire cabin. 14 sleeping places, 14 capricious, frightened, often ill passengers. And she was alone. But where did she sleep herself? That is the saddest question in our history. Most aircraft of the 30s did not provide a place for rest or crew quarters at all. Pilots could nap in turn right in their seats, and the stewardess's bed was the foldable jump seat at the entrance, stiff, narrow, positioned in a draft. If luck was on her side and the flight wasn't full, she could take an empty passenger seat. But in the golden age of aviation, planes flew full. Sometimes, on long transcontinental flights, stewardesses simply laid a blanket on the floor at the tail end near the mailbags. Yes, they slept on the floor, wrapped in coats, while their charges lounged on Egyptian cotton. "Mary, where are you?" asked the pilot as he stepped into the cabin for coffee. "I'm here, Captain," came the voice from below, amid a heap of luggage. "Just checking the securing of the suitcases." On giant flying boats like the Clipper, the situation was somewhat better. They had a crew cubicle, a tiny room with bunk beds where pilots, navigators, flight engineers, and stewardesses, all men, worked and slept in turn. The PAM stewardesses formed a separate caste. They weren't celestial maidens, but celestial butlers. They wore tuxedos or white uniforms, could mix 300 types of cocktails, and spoke 3 languages. Their preparation took place in the finest hotels around the world, yet their night shifts were no less demanding. On a transatlantic flight that lasted over 20 hours, Stewart could be on his feet for up to 18. He was responsible not only for feeding and watering the passengers, but also for cleaning their shoes. We've already mentioned this obsession of the 30s, ironing clothes and even walking the aisles with a broom. Not in the sky, of course, but during layovers at intermediate stops. However, let's return to the flight attendants on domestic routes. Their lives were romanticized only in magazine pages. In reality, it was a constant fight against cold and fatigue. During winter, their uniform included heavy wool coats, capes, and hats. In the unheated tail section of the aircraft, this was their only protection. The girls often fell ill. Common ailments included varicose veins from standing for hours amid vibrations, chronic cystitis, cold, and the inability to visit the toilet frequently, along with hearing problems. But they endured. Furthermore, competition for these positions was fierce. Hundreds of nurses vied for each opening. Why? Firstly, the salary. A stewardess earned about $125 a month. In the 30s, during the height of the Great Depression, that was a fortune. A typical nurse in a hospital made half that. Secondly, for the sense of courage the job bestowed. The statistics were clear. The average career span for a stewardess was just 18 months. No, they were not dismissed for incompetence. They left because they got married. An airplane was the perfect matchmaking agency. Passengers were wealthy, successful men. Pilots were heroes of the nation. Both groups were captivated by these resilient, caring women who could smile through any catastrophe. "Miss, if we survive this storm, I'll marry you," a passenger would shout as the plane dipped into another turbulence. "Agreed, sir. Just hold on to your bag tighter." And they married. The airline's rule was strict. A married stewardess was immediately grounded. A wife can't risk her life and not sleep at home, moralists of that era believed. As a result, staff turnover was enormous, but that only reinforced the myth of youthful freshness among the crew. Yet some stayed. Legendary senior flight attendants who flew for 5 or even 10 years. They knew more about the aircraft than some second pilots. They could identify a malfunction in the engine by sound alone. They knew how to calm a person with epilepsy and how to deliver a baby at 3,000 meters altitude. The first baby was born aboard a plane in 1929, and it caused a sensation. These women established an unwritten code of honor. The passenger was always right, even if he was drunk, terrified, or throwing up on your new shoes. By morning, when the cabin started to wake, the stewardess had to look as if she had just stepped out of a spa. She would touch up her makeup, put on a fresh collar, smile at her reflection in the mirror, hiding the circles under her eyes, and step out into the cabin. "Good morning. I hope you slept well." She would wake the passengers, distribute hot towels, help find lost umbrellas, and soothe crying children. At that moment, she was the mistress of the house, welcoming esteemed guests. She would begin her walkthrough, drawing back the curtains and letting the bright, relentless sun flood into the cabin. The night was over, but the passenger's ordeal was far from finished. Ahead lay descent, pressure changes, and that very moment when one had to look dignified, despite ears that felt ready to burst. In the next chapter, we will learn exactly how this return from the heavens to the earth took place, why all the passengers sat with puffed cheeks, and how the stewardesses saved them from deafening. The descent begins. And then comes that very moment everyone had been waiting for, yet feared simultaneously. The start of the descent. For a modern passenger, this simply means a slight change in the tone of the noise and a request to turn off laptops. But for a passenger of the Golden Age, it was a signal for the beginning of a physical ordeal, a test far beyond what a night's vibration could seem like. A gentle massage. It all started with a sound. The pilot reduced power. The roar of the engines, which you had become accustomed to throughout the night as if it were your own heartbeat, suddenly subsided. The airplane seemed to plunge into a cottony silence, broken only by the whistle of the wind through the vents and the creaking of the fuselage. This moment of transition from thrust to glide triggered a panic attack in half the cabin. "The engines have stopped," someone would whisper with pale lips. "No, sir. We are simply descending from the sky to the ground," the stewardess reassured him, walking along the aisles with a tray. But on that tray were not champagne or coffee. Instead, there lay strategic gear for battling atmospheric pressure, chewing gum and lozenges. Remember, we discussed sealing, or rather, the lack of it. That meant that the pressure inside your head and the pressure outside the plane were the same. While flying at altitude, that pressure was low. As the plane started to dive downward, the external pressure increased rapidly. Yet the air inside your middle ear remained thin and scarce. The result? Your eardrum membranes retracted inward with such force that it felt as if someone was trying to suck your brain out through your ears. The pain was sharp, piercing, sometimes unbearable. "Chew, sir. Chew more actively, as if the fate of the dollar depends on it," the stewardess commanded, literally shoving a Wiggles disc into the mouth of a hefty banker. The entire cabin, from movie stars to politicians, began to work their jaws frantically. It looked grotesque. Society's elite, faces contorted with pain, chewing in unison, eyes bulging as they stared at each other. Experienced flyers employed the Valsalva maneuver, pinching their noses, closing their mouths, and trying to exhale through their ears. Their faces flushed with blood, cheeks swelling like trumpeters. That was the price of returning to the dense layers of the atmosphere. At that moment, no one thought about beauty or status. Everyone only wanted one thing: for the clicking in their heads to stop and the pain to subside. While the passengers fought with their own anatomy, the plane continued its approach to the ground, and that too was a spectacle not for the faint-hearted. Aircraft moved slowly. The landing speed was modest, around 60 to 70 miles per hour. This allowed for detailed observation of the landscape in full detail. You saw the roofs of houses, herds of cows scattering at the shadow of your wing, and the faces of farmers watching the metal bird pass with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Turbulence near the ground intensified. Thermal currents rising from the heated earth tossed the plane as if it were a splinter. It tilted, wobbled, and was thrown from side to side. Pilots in the open or semi-open cockpit worked the yoke and pedals like rowers on galley ships, sweating profusely. And then, the touch. If you think landing on a concrete runway is rough, you've never touched down on the dirt strip of Kansas City Airport in the year of 35. Most airfields then lacked paved runways. It was simply a field, flat in theory, but still a field. The wheels hit the ground. The airplane bounced, then struck again. The series of jumps, which pilots called goose-stepping, was about to begin. Inside the cabin, everything that wasn't bolted down started flying around. Nets with straps bounced wildly, hats flew off heads, and half-drunk water spilled from glasses. The noise was deafening, an incredible din. The aluminum fuselage acted like a resonator, amplifying every impact of a stone hitting the underside and each tightening of the shock absorbers. Landing these flying boats was a different spectacle, yet no less dramatic. The aircraft would crash into the water. The massive hull of the clipper dove into the waves, crashing through with the force of a cannon shot. At speed, the water, as solid as concrete, hammered against the hull with a thunderous roar. The portholes were whipped with foam so thick that for a moment it seemed we might be sinking. The plane suddenly braked, nose-diving into the water, and the passengers hung suspended in their seatbelts. Then, as the movement slowed, the propellers, having given a last snort, came to a stop. An overwhelming silence fell, the very silence we had mentioned earlier. A stewardess, adjusting her disheveled cap, opened the door. "Welcome to Los Angeles." The air temperature was 25 degrees Celsius. As passengers began to stand, a curious thing became apparent. Their legs refused to obey. After 12 or 20 hours of continuous vibration, hypoxia, and sitting in the same position, the vestibular system had gone haywire. People stepped into the aisle, swaying unsteadily. This condition was known as air legs. Similar to sea legs, but in the air, the solid ground proved to be treacherously immobile. The brain, which had tuned into the engine vibrations overnight, interpreted the lack of jostling as a warning signal, causing passengers to walk with cautious, tentative steps, like cautious explorers. As they stepped onto the gangway, they squinted against the bright sun. They looked peculiar, like the arrival photos of stars from the 30s. They smiled, waved, but if you looked closer, you'd see deep shadows under their eyes, slightly rumpled suits as if they hadn't been ironed, and tense, strained postures. This was the condition we now call jet lag, but back then it was something more. It was aviation intoxication, a mixture of oxygen deprivation, dehydration, hangover from alcohol, and sensory overload from the noise. People felt as if they had been passed through a meat grinder and then reassembled, missing a few parts. Their ears rang, their voices hoarse from trying to overpower the engines. Their skin was dry and tight, yet their eyes burned with the fire of victory. They descended the stairs not as victims, but as triumphant conquerors. Below, reporters with magnesium flashbulbs awaited them, relatives with flowers, and zivaki, local officials, behind the fence at the airfield. To the crowd below, these people seemed like gods. They had come down from the clouds. They had seen what no one else had seen. They drank coffee above the Grand Canyon and slept over the Mississippi. "Mr. Gable, how was the flight?" the reporters shouted. "Magnificent," Clark Gable replied, hiding the fact that he still felt a bit queasy. Aviation was the future, and indeed it was, but a future that demanded resilience akin to that of a Spartan. After a brief photo session, the passengers settled into their cars, and only in the quiet comfort of the limousine did the true fatigue hit them. Many fell asleep instantly before reaching the hotel. Meanwhile, at the airfield, another life was beginning. Mechanics covered in oil threw themselves at the aircraft. They needed to check the engines, patch up the fuselage, and refuel the tanks. Stewards, no longer smiling but utterly exhausted, gathered the soiled linens into bags and recounted the silverware, wondering if someone had stolen a fork as a souvenir. The flying hotel was turning into nothing more than a machine, cooling in the wind. The era of propeller aviation was an age of physical contact with the elements. You felt the air, you heard it, you fought against it. Comfort was merely a thin film stretched over the wild power of nature and primitive technology by today's standards. But time moved on. Engineers in their offices were already designing new wings, wings that no longer needed propellers. Wings meant to lift humans to such heights where there was no weather, no potholes, and almost no air. The jet age was approaching, an age that promised speed. Yet, as is often the case, everything came at a cost, and the price of speed was the bed. In the upcoming final part, we will reflect on our journey. We will see how the Boeing 707 and the Hanland Comet buried the romance of overnight trips, turning flying into nothing more than a seat on a bus. Why did we agree to swap starch linen sheets and porcelain for a plastic tray and a narrow seat? And is there any hope that the golden age might someday return? One morning at the end of the 1950s, the world awoke to a new sound. It was an unfamiliar, guttural rumble from piston engines that made the windows tremble. It was a high, piercing whistling, like the sound of a giant kettle about to boil. They appeared in the sky, reactive liners, the Hanland Comet, and shortly after, Boeing 77 and Douglas DC-8. They were sleek, predatory, swift in their beauty. No longer did they have propellers slicing through the air. Instead, they drew the sky into themselves and spat it out behind in a blazing jet stream. For passengers, this marked a revolution. Suddenly, New York was twice as close to London. The journey, which once took a tiresome 124 hours with refueling stops, now lasted about 6 or 7. "Listen, dear," said the husband to his wife, examining a promotional booklet. "We'll have breakfast at home and dinner in Paris. We no longer need to spend the night in the sky." And in that phrase, "we no longer need to spend the night in the sky," lay the death sentence for an entire era, the demise of sleeping quarters. The airline's logic was as firm as a Boeing wing. If a flight lasted only 6 hours, why would a passenger need a bed? Why waste precious space and weight on mattresses, curtains, and stairs when you could simply put in more seats? Many seats. Very many seats. The era of the airline empire had begun. Of course, it didn't happen instantly. The first jet airplanes still tried to cling to old traditions. The Boeing 77 featured luxurious lounges with sofas and a piano. In first class, it was still possible to nearly lie flat in a seat, but the trend was unmistakable. The bed became an archaic relic. Engineers calculated that one full sleeping berth could be replaced by 3 or even 4 sitting seats. Logic triumphed over romance. Ticket prices became relatively more affordable, and crowds flooded into the skies. Flying was no longer the privilege of brave souls in fur coats. It became routine, a winged bus. The atmosphere of an exclusive club, as we once knew it, vanished. In a cabin of 150 people, it was impossible to know everyone by name. Impossible to hold a pajama parade because there simply wasn't enough space in the aisle. Impossible to feel like an explorer when a fellow passenger sits beside you, munching on a plastic chicken from a space pod. Yes, comfort changed. Silence replaced vibrations, and the roar of engines was gone. Finally, the cabin had grown warm, and the smell of gasoline no longer filled the air. Yet, with that comfort, the sense of wonder and participation in the miracle had faded. We stopped looking out the window. In the 30s, every passenger knew the geography by heart because it drifted past beneath the wing. In the jet age, we had risen 10 kilometers above the ground. The Earth became an abstract map. Clouds, once fierce enemies, now appeared as a simple white ceiling stretching below us. And what about sleep? Falling asleep on a plane had gone from a ritual to a torment. We had learned to sleep in fetal position, curled up in our seats. We invented inflatable pillows shaped like horseshoes, resembling orthopedic collars for accident victims. We figured out how to sleep with our mouths open, resting our heads on a stranger's shoulder, hoping he wouldn't mind. "Sorry, I think I've just drooled on your jacket," a modern passenger might say awkwardly. "It's no problem," replies the neighbor with a sigh. "I just almost dislocated my neck myself." We had lost the ability to stretch out our legs. We had lost the horizon. Humanity, having conquered gravity, found itself powerless against the economy of the seat row. Of course, today there is first class and business class with reclining capsules. There are beds, pajamas, even showers on the Airbus A380. But let's be honest, that's available to only 1% of travelers. For the remaining 99%, the golden age has ended before it even began. Yet, I find myself thinking, as I look at old photographs from those years, at these black and white images of people in suits sitting in woven armchairs, I don't dwell on comfort. I think about fear and overcoming it. Those people, our grandmothers and grandfathers, flew despite everything. They were cold, terrified, nauseous, deafened by noise, but they flew. They trusted their fragile wooden and fabric floors to hold them. They fell asleep to the roar of engines, knowing they might never wake up, yet believing they would find themselves in another world. Sleeping on an airplane in the 30s was an act of trust. Trust in the pilot, the mechanic, and that celestial girl who adjusted the blanket. It was a collective unconscious experience of wonder. Today we board a plane, put on headphones, start a movie, and complain about slow Wi-Fi. We've forgotten that simply being here is magic. We forget that behind the thin shell lies a temperature of 50 degrees below zero and an icy abyss. We have become too confident, perhaps, and that's why sleep feels so uncomfortable. Maybe it's the price we pay for our carelessness. The sky does not like to be taken for granted. It demands respect. And perhaps that ache in a stiff neck after an 8-hour flight is a reminder that we are still just biological creatures daring to challenge the gods. The story of sleeping through flights isn't about mattresses and pillows. It is the story of human spirit, a spirit willing to endure discomfort just to see what lies beyond the horizon. And if one night, crossing over the ocean, you suddenly wake up and see the moon reflected in the wing through the porthole, remember them. Recall that gentleman in pajamas trying to shave during turbulence. Remember the woman in fur, cold but smiling. Remember the stewardess sleeping on bags of mail. They paved the way for us. They taught us not to fear the night. And even if we don't have their starched sheets or silver forks, we have something they could only dream of: safety. We will reach our destination. We will definitely arrive. And now, dear viewers, please bring your seatbacks to the upright position and fasten your seatbelts. Our long historical journey has come to an end. We hope that, despite the turbulence zone in the middle of the story, you felt comfortable throughout. Sleep peacefully, and may you dream of clouds. Thank you for watching Lectures Under the Moon with Daniel Hayes. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.